Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. My job is to make sure things are seen accurately. That's the whole of it. I show up before the archaeologists, before the conservators, before anyone else who has an opinion about what they're looking at, and I photograph everything exactly as it came out of the ground. No interpretation, no context, no narrative, just light and shadow, and a record that says, "This is what was here. This is what it looked like. This is the truth of it," before anyone touched it. I've been doing this for 7 years across 4 countries. I've documented Roman villas and medieval chapels and a Bronze Age settlement in the Scottish Highlands that turned out to be significantly less exciting than the grant application suggested. The work requires patience and a good eye, and the ability to stay professionally detached from things that are sometimes genuinely extraordinary. You learn to see without reacting. You learn to let the camera do the responding and keep yourself out of it. I was not entirely able to do that at Pompeii. I want to be precise about that because precision is what I have. I'm not going to tell you I was overwhelmed or that the site broke something open in me or any of the language people use when they want to make an experience sound larger than it was. What I'll tell you is that I went in with 7 years of professional detachment intact, and I came out with something I haven't been able to file correctly, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with it ever since. The contract came through my firm in March. 6 weeks at Pompeii, documenting a newly opened section in the Vesuvius area, the part of the site that's been producing significant finds over the past several years, a corridor of structures that connected to a previously excavated area in a way the archaeological team was being careful about. My contact on site was Dr. Fabio Conti, senior archaeologist, 20 years at Pompeii, the kind of meticulous that makes other meticulous people feel approximate. I liked working with Conti. He was direct and organized, and he left me alone to do my job, which is the best thing a site contact can do. He briefed me thoroughly on the first day, walked me through the new section, explained what the team was working on and what they needed from the documentation record. He was cautious about the corridor section in a way I noticed but didn't examine. Some sites have politically sensitive areas, disputed interpretations, ongoing academic arguments that you step around as a contractor. I assumed it was that. 6 weeks. My mornings were mine. I went in before the team every day, before anyone else's footprints disturbed the context, and I photographed everything in the new section, systematically, from one end to the other. By the end of the 3rd week, I knew those rooms, the way you know a house you've lived in, every corner and surface and smell, the particular quality of the morning light coming through the protective covering over the site. The burned room I found on a Tuesday. It was toward the far end of the corridor section, a room I'd been building toward all week as the team slowly cleared the fill in that direction. The morning it was ready for documentation, I went in with my equipment and worked the space the way I always work a new room. Wide shots first for context, then medium shots for architectural detail, then close work on anything that warranted it. The the floor stopped me. Not the upper floor, which was intact and consistent with the surrounding rooms. The lower floor, visible through a section where the upper layer had partially collapsed, which was not architecturally unusual because buildings get renovated, floors get raised over existing ones. That happens throughout the site. What was unusual was the lower floor's surface. Fire damage, clear and unambiguous fire damage, the kind you learn to distinguish from volcanic damage when you've spent enough time at sites like this. Ash that had settled from above would leave a different pattern entirely. What was on the lower floor of that room was charring. Heat stress radiating from the center of the room outward in the pattern of something that had burned inside the space, something that had sat in the middle of that room and burned with enough sustained heat to mark the stone. Something had been on fire in that room before Vesuvius erupted. The eruption that buried Pompeii came from above and outside. It did not come from the center of a ground-level room. I photographed the floor from 8 angles, flagged it in my documentation notes with a timestamp and a brief description, marked it for Conti's attention, and moved on to the next room. This is the correct professional response to finding something anomalous. You record it, and you escalate it, and you keep working. That evening, I went back to my rented flat in Naples, and I reviewed the day's photographs, and everything was fine and well exposed and thoroughly documented. And then I reached the last image from the burned room. I had photographed the far wall as part of the standard documentation. It had painted plaster on it, which is common throughout Pompeii, domestic decoration, usually geometric borders or simple figural scenes. I'd clocked it as decorative in the field and moved on. On my laptop screen, enlarged to full resolution the way I enlarge everything for the evening cull, I could see what I'd missed. The painted plaster was not decorative. It was a crowd of figures, Roman domestic art style, the simplified flat rendering you see throughout the site. But the figures were not arranged in a domestic scene. They were moving, all of them, every figure in the painting, moving in the same direction across the wall. And the ones at the rear of the crowd, the ones furthest from wherever they were going, were turned, looking back, their posture and the angle of their heads rendered with real care, real attention to the specific way a body arranges itself when it's afraid of what's behind it. And behind them, at the section of wall where the subject of their fear should have been, was nothing. Not damaged plaster. Not a section where the paint had deteriorated or flaked. The surface was intact, the paint layer present and even. The artist had painted the crowd's fear in full detail and then deliberately, carefully left blank the thing that caused it. I looked at that image for a long time. Then I marked it for Conti's attention, closed my laptop, and told myself it was interesting, and that interesting was his department. I showed Conti the photograph the next morning. He looked at it for 4 seconds. I know it was 4 seconds because I was watching him and counting, the way you count when you know that how long someone looks at something is itself information. 4 seconds is not enough time to have absorbed the detail of what was in that image. He already knew what was on that wall. He closed my laptop and handed it back and asked me in a voice that was very quiet and very level whether I'd shown it to anyone else. I told him no. He said the painted plaster was a known feature of the room, that there was an ongoing academic discussion about its interpretation, and that he'd prefer the image didn't circulate before the relevant paper was published. He said it as a reasonable explanation, and it was technically reasonable. But I've navigated the academic politics of heritage sites for 7 years. I know what a researcher protecting a finding looks like, the particular combination of caution and ownership and professional anxiety. That is not what I was looking at. I was looking at a man who already knew what was on that wall and was frightened that I'd seen it. I told him I understood and went back to work. That afternoon, I pulled the excavation records for the corridor section from the site and archive. I had legitimate access for documentation purposes. I was looking for the earlier survey notes Conti had mentioned, the ones that documented the painted plaster as a known feature. The records for the corridor section had a gap in them, 3 weeks of survey work, the 3 weeks immediately before the current excavation phase began, simply absent. The archive folder for that period existed. It had a label. It was empty. I spent my evenings for the next several days going through my photographs in a way I'd never gone through photographs before. I am not an archaeologist. I don't have the training to interpret what I see at a site, only to see it clearly. But I've spent 7 years photographing these places, and some things become apparent through volume of exposure, even without formal training. You start to understand what normal looks like, and normal lets you see what isn't. I went through the corridor section images looking for connections. At first, I was looking for more anomalies like the burned floor and the painted wall. I found some, but what I found more of was harder to name and took me longer to recognize because I was looking for presence rather than absence. Pompeii is full of the dead. Everyone knows this. It's the defining feature of the site, the casts of people frozen in their final moments distributed throughout the excavated city. They're everywhere, in doorways and on floors and in the positions they fell when the pyroclastic surge overtook them. You encounter them constantly working across the site. The corridor section had none, not a single cast, not a single set of remains. I went through every image from every room in that section of the dig, and there was no evidence of anyone dying there when Vesuvius erupted. The buildings were fully furnished. Food, tools, pottery, all the evidence of inhabited spaces being actively used. But no one was in these buildings when the ash came down. They'd been emptied before the eruption. Not in the final hours, not in the desperate last-minute flight that accounted for most of Pompeii's dead who didn't make it out. Earlier than that, quietly and deliberately, with everything left in place, the belongings still arranged as if their owners stepped out for an errand and expected to be back before dark. Something happened in the corridor section before Vesuvius erupted. A room was burned from the inside. The buildings were emptied. A crowd was painted onto a wall with real skill and care, all of them looking back at something the painter chose not to show. I went to Conti. I didn't show him my reasoning. I showed him one thing, a side-by-side of cast locations across the wider excavated site mapped against the corridor section, pulled together from the documentation archive and laid out so the absence in the corridor was visually undeniable. It took me about an hour to compile, and it was, I think, the clearest image I've ever put together. Conti looked at it for much longer than he'd looked at the photograph. Then he sat down. I had not seen him sit during a working conversation in 6 weeks. He sat in the folding chair near the archive shelf, and he was quiet, and the quiet had a specific weight to it that I recognized from certain conversations with certain people, the weight of someone who has decided that the thing they've been not saying is going to have to be said. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't offer a reasonable explanation. He said that Pompeii had been excavated for more than 250 years, that in that time, certain sections of the site had been opened and then closed again. Not for structural reasons, not for conservation reasons, for no reason that appeared in the official record. He said the corridor section was one of those areas. Opened in the 19th century, closed. Opened in the 1950s, closed. Each time, the excavation notes from the reopening disappeared before they could be formally archived. He said he didn't know whether they were removed or whether the people who wrote them simply chose not to file them, and that he'd stopped thinking the distinction mattered. He said he'd inherited the current phase of the corridor excavation from a colleague who retired very suddenly and relocated to a part of Italy he had no prior connection to and had not responded to emails in 8 months. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said there was a phrase in Latin he kept returning to. He said the translation was rough, but the meaning was something like, "The seal is not the punishment. The seal is the mercy." He said it the way you say something you didn't originate, something you picked up from someone else and have been carrying around long enough that it started to feel like yours. He stood up. He told me he'd like me to wrap up the corridor documentation in the next 2 days and that the contract would be considered complete with full payment, regardless of the remaining weeks. I asked him what was in the corridor section. He said he didn't know. He said the honest answer was that nobody who'd gotten close enough to understand it had found a clean way to explain it afterward. He said he was too close to retirement to be the next person to try. He walked away. I stood in the archive room for a while after he left. The seal is not the punishment. The seal is the mercy. I thought about the crowd on the painted wall, all those figures moving in the same direction, looking back at the blank space where the cause of their fear had been painted out. I thought about the emptied buildings and the burned floor and the missing archive records and the colleague who moved to a part of Italy he had no connection to and stopped answering his emails. I had 2 days left. I went in at first light on the second to last day. The corridor section was cold in the early morning, the way stone is always cold when the sun hasn't reached it yet. My footsteps were too clear in the quiet. I set up my equipment at the far end and worked back toward the main site, the same way I always worked, keeping to the method because the method is what you have when everything else is uncertain. I saved the burned room for last. I spent 40 minutes in there. I photographed everything, every surface, the flooring and the fire damage, and the wall with the crowd, the blank section where the cause of their fear should have been. I took more images of that wall than I'd taken of any single surface in 6 weeks, because I am a person who documents things accurately, and if I was going to have a record of this room, I wanted it to be thorough. I was packing my equipment when I noticed the wall was different, not dramatically, not in a way that would register without a reference photograph to compare it to. but I had the reference photograph on my camera's review screen. 3 weeks old, same wall, same section, and I held the screen up next to the wall and looked between them. The blank section was smaller, not by much, a few centimeters at the left edge, but where 3 weeks ago there had been nothing, now there was something. Faint, close to the same color as the surrounding plaster, the kind of thing you would walk past 1,000 times and never clock. The outline of a shape, just the edge of it, appearing at the leftmost margin of the blank section, as if what had been painted over was gradually coming back through the plaster. Not through deterioration or flaking or any process of decay. The plaster was completely intact. It looked more like something pressing through from beneath, working its way back to the surface at its own pace, patient, unhurried. 2,000 years, and counting meaning nothing to whatever it was. I took 12 photographs of it. Then I packed my bag and I walked out of the corridor section and back through the main site and out through the gate, and I did not go back for my last scheduled day. I'm home in Edinburgh. I have a flat I like and a cat named Wick, who is indifferent to me in a way I find soothing, and enough work lined up through the following year that I'm not thinking about Pompeii in any practical sense. I submitted my documentation, filed my final report, collected my payment. The professional part of this is finished. I have the photographs, all of them backed up in 3 locations the way I back up everything, organized by date and section and room number. The burned floor, the painted wall with the crowd, the blank section and the figures looking back at it, and the final morning's shoot, the 12 images of the shape beginning to appear at the left edge of the blank section. I haven't submitted those 12 images to the documentation record. I've thought about this a lot. I've constructed the professional rationale several times because the professional rationale is genuinely reasonable. Unexplained anomalies need archaeological context before they enter the official record. Filing something you don't understand creates confusion rather than clarity. Incomplete documentation is sometimes worse than no documentation. All of that is true, and none of it is the whole truth. The whole truth is that I don't know what submitting those images would do, who would look at them, what looking at them carefully might put in motion. Conti walked away. His predecessor walked away and moved somewhere unfamiliar and went quiet. Every person who got close enough to understand the corridor section eventually chose distance, and I've been trying to work out whether I'm the kind of person who makes a different choice or the kind who understands why they didn't. I haven't worked it out yet. There was a paper published about 6 months after I came home. Conti's name on it, the corridor section, as the subject. I read it carefully, and it was measured and thorough and covered the urban layout discrepancies and the flooring anomalies and the absence of remains in language that was precise and professionally cautious and said everything except the things that mattered. The painted wall appeared in one footnote as a decorative feature of uncertain iconographic origin. The blank section was not mentioned. In the acknowledgements, he thanked the documentation team for their thorough work. I've looked at the final image many times, the shape at the left edge of the blank section. I've tried to determine what the outline belongs to, what larger form that partial edge is part of. I'm a photographer and not an artist, and the shape without its full context isn't something I can interpret. is just a line, the beginning of something. But the painter who made that wall was skilled. I keep coming back to that because it's the thing I can be certain about. Observable fact, no interpretation required. The crowd is rendered with real craft. The body language of people who are afraid and moving away from something they cannot outrun is something very few artists get right. And this one got it right 2,000 years ago on a wall in a city that a volcano buried and that everyone has been digging up ever since. They painted the crowd and they painted the fear, and then they stopped. They put paint over whatever was at the center of it, plastered it, and then the volcano came and covered everything in meters of ash and rock, and the city stayed buried for 1,600 years before anyone started pulling it back out. 2,000 years of that blank section on the wall. And it's getting smaller. I don't know the rate of it. I have 2 reference points, 3 weeks apart, and the change between them was small enough that I almost missed it. Maybe it's slow enough that it resolves to nothing in any human lifetime that matters. Maybe what I photographed was the beginning of a process that takes another 1,000 years. I don't know, and I don't have a way to find out without going back, and I'm not going back. What I keep thinking about is the phrase Conti repeated. The seal is not the punishment. The seal is the mercy. He said he didn't know where the phrase originated. I've looked and I haven't found it either, which either means it comes from something obscure or it comes from one of the people who opened the corridor section and closed it again and didn't file their notes, and it got passed along quietly between the people who knew to pass it. Someone painted over what was on that wall deliberately and with care. Someone emptied those buildings before anyone told them to leave. Someone burned something in that room, or tried to, for reasons that made sense to them at the time. The eruption happened. Vesuvius buried everything under meters of rock, and the buried city stayed sealed for 16 centuries. The seal is the mercy. And everyone has been digging it up for 250 years. I have 12 photographs on an archival drive in my flat in Edinburgh, and I'm still deciding what kind of person I am. The blank section is getting smaller. I don't know what's on the other side of it. I'm not sure I want to be the one who finds out.